Welcome to the Deep Dive, the show that takes a stack of sources, articles, research, sometimes centuries of controversial philosophy, and extracts the precise nuggets of knowledge and insight you need to fully grasp the figures who define modernity.
Today, we are opening the file on a monumental and profoundly disruptive thinker from the 17th century, Baruch Spinoza.
Right, and this is a man whose rigorous, almost mathematical approach to truth caused him to be expelled from his community in, the harshest possible way.
And subsequently labeled the most dangerous atheist of his age, which is ironic because his philosophy is, in a way, all about God.
That's the paradox we're getting into. We are diving deep into the life and the radical thought of Baruch Spinoza, born in 1632, who died too young in 1677. Our mission today is a critical one, to unpack the most crucial insights from the sources regarding his controversial life and, maybe more importantly, his breathtaking philosophy, which just fundamentally reshaped our concepts of God, nature, and, human freedom.
Spinoza's system is essential. You can argue it laid the intellectual groundwork for the Age of Enlightenment. We're going to examine how his work challenged traditional religious and political authority.
From his masterwork, The Ethics, which is written in this incredible way.
Geometric proofs. Yeah.
All the way to his defining and still scandalous equation of reality, Deus is Natura.
God or nature. The two are one and the same.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start with the man and his environment, because the context of 17th century Amsterdam is absolutely essential to understanding why his ideas were so explosive and why they led to his exile.
It really is. You can't separate the philosophy from the life.
So let's get into it. Part 1. The life of a radical.
Spinoza's origins are critical. He was born Baruch Spinoza in 1632 in the Dutch Republic to a family of Portuguese Jews, and they were Marranos.
Okay, so that term, Marrano, what does it mean for his family history?
It means their ancestors had been forced, under the threat of the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisitions, to convert to Catholicism.
So on the surface, they were Catholic.
Right. Outwardly Catholic for generations, but many of them, and we can probably assume Spinoza's family as well, were practicing crypto-Judaism. They were Jewish in secret.
That immediately gives us this historical tension, doesn't it? They arrive in Amsterdam seeking religious tolerance, but they're already accustomed to living a kind of double life, one public, one private, after generations of persecution.
Precisely. And Amsterdam was, relatively tolerant. It's often described as a haven for religious dissenters, but that tolerance was fragile.
It had conditions.
It had conditions, big ones. It existed on the condition that religious practice remained discreet, especially non-Christian practice, and most importantly, that the various communities did not disturb the civil peace or provoke the Dutch Calvinist authorities.
So rock the boat.
Do not rock the boat. And the Spinoza family, especially his father Michael, was a big deal in the community. He was a prominent, wealthy merchant, and he even served as an officer of the United Congregation, the Natura.
So young Baruch had a very traditional and academically rich start, right? He's attending the Natura school, he's soaking up the sacred texts, the literature of the community.
Yes, a rigorous classical education. He was a brilliant student. But his life took a pretty sharp turn when he was still quite young.
What happened?
The sources indicate that his older brother, Isaac, who was the one expected to inherit and run the family business, died prematurely in 1649. And that loss suddenly pulled the scholarly Baruch away from his books and straight into the family's commercial enterprise.
So we see this shift then. The intellectual ambitions get momentarily sidelined for commerce. And this happened, I believe, right when the successful family firm was starting to struggle financially.
The timing couldn't have been worse, really. The First Anglo-Dutch War from 1652 to 1654 just crippled the Spinoza firm. English ships seized a lot of their valuable cargo, their shipping lines were disrupted, and the business was suddenly saddled with substantial debt. So when Michael Spinoza, the father, died in 1654, Baruch, then in his early 20s, inherited, not a thriving enterprise, but a heap of financial obligations.
The family fortune was gone.
By 1655, it was essentially gone.
Okay, and this is where the personal financial crisis starts to metastasize into an ideological and ultimately a religious one. The sources suggest the path to his expulsion was really paved with legal paperwork.
Absolutely. The crisis point arrives in March of 1656. To protect himself from creditors and this inherited debt, Spinoza took a really radical legal step.
What did he do?
He appealed to the city authorities, so the secular power of Amsterdam, to declare him a legal minor or an orphan.
Which would do what for him, legally?
It would allow him to renounce his inheritance and therefore escape the debts. It was a clever legal move.
Legally, he's just using the Dutch civil code to protect his future. But in doing so, he broke a major rule within the synagogue.
Critically so. The synagogue had a very strict regulation that all business disputes, especially internal ones about debt or inheritance, had to be arbitrated internally within the community structure.
You don't air your dirty laundry in public.
And you certainly don't go to the secular court. By doing that, he publicly undermined the autonomy and the authority of the community leadership. That's one huge layer of offense.
But the community's fear was deeper than just a bookkeeping dispute, right? This was about survival.
Exactly. This brings us right back to that fragile tolerance in Amsterdam. The municipal government had explicitly ordered the Jewish community to keep strict religious observance and civil order.
So the leaders were walking on eggshells.
They were terrified. They were terrified that Spinoza's increasingly controversial philosophical views, which were already becoming known through his conversations with, free thinkers and dissidents, would lead to persecution, or worse, the expulsion of the entire community.
Because the civil authorities would just see it as the Jewish community failing to maintain order.
Failing to control their own? So his intellectual radicalism was viewed as a genuine existential threat to hundreds of families.
And that provides this chilling context for the severity of the punishment that came next.
On July 27, 1656, at only 23 years old, the community leaders issued the herem, the writ of censure.
And our sources stress this wasn't just any censure.
No. This was the harshest censure ever pronounced in that community's history. It was read out loud in the synagogue.
And the language was extreme, wasn't it? They didn't even detail his philosophical crime. They just invoked abominable heresies and monstrous deeds.
They chose that vagueness deliberately. It was a strategy. By not publicizing his specific theological challenges, which we now know included denying the immortality of the soul, questioning the design authorship of the Torah, things like that.
Really fundamental stuff.
Core tenets. By keeping it vague, they avoided inflaming the general public and provoking the Dutch Calvinists. They were essentially sending a message. We have dealt with our internal radical. Please do not punish us all for his sins.
It's fascinating, though, that even before his major works were published, his skepticism was already so disruptive. He was related to another controversial figure, Uriel da Costa.
Yes, through his mother. Da Costa had been excommunicated twice for questioning fundamentals. He was a cautionary tale.
So Spinoza wasn't the first, but his case was handled with this unprecedented finality.
Spinoza's case was different because he refused to repent. He refused to recant. He just accepted the expulsion, embraced his isolation, and moved on. The herem was never rescinded because, frankly, there was nothing Spinoza wanted to return to.
He distanced himself from all religious affiliations. He didn't convert to Christianity.
No, he became purely secular, a man of philosophy alone.
And his life completely shifts. He dedicates himself entirely to philosophical inquiry, and he sustains himself through a truly remarkable trade in lens grinding.
It's a beautifully symbolic choice, really, when you think about it. Lens grinding requires meticulous precision, enormous patience, and a deep scientific understanding of light and optics. I mean, these are the very tools of the scientific revolution. He became a highly skilled craftsman, constructing optical instruments, microscopes, telescopes.
And the quality wasn't just good. It was recognized by the intellectual elite of Europe.
Absolutely. Christian Huygens, who was one of the most important astronomers and physicists of the age, he praised the quality of Spinoza's lenses.
Wow.
So this shows us that Spinoza was still deeply embedded in the intellectual community, corresponding with them, working alongside the scientific revolution, even while living this solitary, frugal life that relied heavily on occasional support from his loyal friends.
This shift from prominent merchant's son to anonymous, isolated craftsman, it forced him to adopt a philosophy of personal safety, which is perfectly captured by his signet ring.
Yes, that signet ring. It was engraved with the Latin word cat.
Cat, meaning caution.
Caution, or be cautious, and an image of a thorny rose. It was his personal motto and his warning. It perfectly reflects the dangerous necessity of secrecy and self-protection in the 17th century.
Ideas were lethal.
They were. Publishing the wrong thought could land you in prison or worse. The thorny rose. Beautiful, insightful philosophy, but protected by the thorns of caution.
So Spinoza is now isolated, cautious, but intensely intellectually active. This period after 1656 really defines the trajectory of his thought. He needs the tools to construct his radical philosophy. And those tools came from his new intellectual circle.
His education in Latin, the arts and sciences, began in earnest with a man named Franciscus van den Enden.
And who was he?
A fascinating character, a former Jesuit, but also a staunch political radical and, by many accounts, an avowed atheist. Van den Enden is the one who introduced him to modern philosophy, with René Descartes being the dominant influence at the time.
Descartes, the man who argued for radical doubt and established that famous dualism of mind and body. Spinoza clearly found his initial framework there.
He did, but he very quickly moved past Descartes. It was through this period that Spinoza attracted what was often derisively called a philosophical sect.
A sect.
It was a dedicated circle of followers and friends, people like Lodewijk Meyer, Gerrit Gels, who were often secularized freethinkers, religious dissidents, or members of these sort of fringe Christian groups like the Collegiants.
But this wasn't just a book club, though. The sources suggest this group functioned as a crucial intellectual crucible for him.
It was their private university. It was a testing ground. They meticulously scrutinized early drafts of his masterpiece, The Ethics. They were a mirror for his ideas, allowing him to hone his arguments against critical, intelligent minds.
But they paid a social price for it.
Oh, yes. They were publicly despised in Amsterdam, broadly disparaged as dangerous atheists just for questioning orthodox religious views. And this, of course, only reinforced Spinoza's need for caution, for caught.
Now, when he decided to finally publish something under his own name, he didn't start with his own revolutionary system. His first major publication was actually an exposition of Descartes.
That's right.
But it was revolutionary for its method.
Exactly. His Descartes' Principles of Philosophy from 1663 was crucial not for its content, but for its form. It's where he established his famous geometric method.
We often hear this phrase, geometric method, but why was it so important to a philosopher? I mean, why is structure philosophy like Euclid's geometry?
Spinoza believed that traditional philosophical prose, which relies on, rhetoric, metaphor, persuasion, it was inherently flawed. It was subject to human bias and emotion.
He wanted to remove the messy human element.
He wanted to remove all of it.
Yeah.
He saw mathematics, particularly geometry, as the only pure path to truth because it begins from self-evident definitions and axioms and then proceeds through these absolutely necessary propositions and proofs.
So she's trying to demonstrate the necessity of his conclusions rather than merely arguing for them.
It was an attempt to make philosophy as demonstrable and irrefutable as 2 + 2 = 4. He saw this rigorous mathematical structure as the key to reaching the highest truth and ultimately achieving a state of intellectual peace and harmony.
If you accept the starting points.
You must accept the conclusions. There's no room for debate. And this method, the scaffolding, is what he would use to build his greatest work, the Ethics.
That structural rigor is astonishing. But he then followed it up with a book that was, well, intentionally inflammatory. It was designed to disrupt the political order, the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, the TTP.
The TTP, published in 1670, is rightly described by our sources as one of the most important books of Western thought. He started writing it around 1665, prompted by the chaotic political environment of the Second Anglo-Dutch War. It was a comprehensive intervention into theology, politics, and war.
So what were the core revolutionary arguments that sent Europe into a complete uproar?
There were 2 major lines of attack, both utterly radical for the time. First, he used rigorous biblical criticism and legal analysis to argue for the complete separation of church and state.
And what did that mean, practically?
It meant that ecclesiastic authority should have absolutely no role in the function of a secular democratic state.
So religious leaders shouldn't be dictating civil law or foreign policy or public education. I mean, that is a truly modern concept being birthed right there.
It is the foundation of secular liberalism, and the second radical argument was theological. He subjected the Hebrew Bible to unprecedented critical scrutiny.
How so?
He openly questioned its divine origin. He argued that the prophets were men of vivid imagination, not necessarily reliable conduits of objective truth, and that the laws in the Bible were specific to ancient Jewish kingdoms and held no legal authority over modern secular governments.
So the TTP was essentially a demolition of theocracy. It questioned the very concept of divine revelation as a source of political authority.
Exactly. And for that reason, it had to be published anonymously. Under a fictitious publisher and a fake place of publication, the scandal was immediate and intense.
We're attacking it.
Scholars all across Europe, even Thomas Hobbes, who ironically agreed with many of the political conclusions, attacked the TTP as dangerous, subversive, and, undermining the very foundations of civil society.
And Spinoza knew the risks intimately, didn't he? He had the tragic fate of his friend to remember.
He did. The memory of Adrian Corbag was a potent lesson. Corbag had published similar ideas denying divine authorship, the impossibility of miracles, but he made a fatal error.
Which was?
He published in Dutch. For the masses. He was arrested, thrown in prison, and died shortly afterward from the harsh conditions.
So Spinoza's Kant motto dictated his publishing strategy for the TTP.
It absolutely confirmed it. His book was significantly safer because it was written in Latin. He was intentionally targeting a narrower, intellectual, and educated elite academics, philosophers, theologians.
And the sources confirmed this was a deliberate strategy.
Oh, yes. Spinoza explicitly forbade its translation into Dutch. He wanted to ensure the general populace, the potentially riotous or easily offended public, wouldn't be able to easily access or weaponize his ideas. He was aiming for an intellectual revolution, not a street fight.
The TTP was his public political intervention. But the Ethics, which was published after he died, is his attempt to redefine reality itself. Let's move to the core of his thought. The system that tries to explain the universe, God, humanity, and freedom all derive logically using that geometric method.
The Ethics is Spinoza's profoundest philosophical legacy. It belongs firmly to that 17th century rationalist school, along with Descartes and Leibniz. It assumes that reality is perfectly intelligible to reason, just like mathematics is.
He's aiming for perfect logical deduction from self-evident truths.
That's the goal.
But he takes this giant leap past his predecessor, Descartes, by collapsing all of reality into a single entity. He rejects the idea of mind and body as separate things.
He does, which is why we have to start with his metaphysical triad.
Yeah.
Substance, attributes, and modes. Let's break down substance first.
Okay, what is substance?
Substance is the absolute foundation of his entire system, and he defines it with that geometric rigor. Substance is that which is conceived through itself and requires nothing external for its understanding or existence.
So it's completely self-sufficient.
It is the ultimate cause of itself, or causa sui. It is eternal, infinite, and it necessarily exists. It can't not exist.
And the immediate revolutionary logical deduction he makes from this definition is that there can only be one such thing.
Precisely. If there were two substances, they would have to limit each other, right? Which would make neither one of them truly infinite. Therefore, there can only be one absolutely infinite, eternal, and independent substance.
And that single substance, Spinoza declares, is God.
God or nature.
Okay, now let's define the other two terms, starting with modes. I think those are a little easier to grasp.
Modes are the exact opposite of substance. They are things that cannot exist independently. They must exist as a modification of something else.
So everything we see and touch.
Exactly. Modes include all individual objects, properties, relations, events, everything we see, touch, or think about.
So my body is a mode, my individual thoughts are modes, and the entire physical universe, the cosmos itself, is a giant, though infinite, mode of substance.
That's correct. It is the structure, or the modification, not the underlying essence itself.
Okay, which brings us to attributes, the critical middle term that connects the two. How does Spinoza define attributes and how do they function here?
Attributes are what the intellect perceives as constituting the very essence of substance. Now, God, being the one infinite substance, must have an infinite number of attributes.
But we can't perceive all of them.
As finite human beings, as modes, we are only aware of two of these infinite attributes: thought, the mental or ideational, and extension, the physical or spatial.
So we only get to see two sides of an infinite coin. And those two sides, thought and extension, they represent complete parallel accounts of reality.
Exactly. They're like two fundamentally different languages that perfectly describe the exact same event. They never interact. Thought does not cause extension, and extension does not cause thought.
They just mirror each other.
They perfectly mirror each other because they are both expressions of the single unified substance.
This technical framework brings us to the most defining and, I guess, notorious phrase in his entire philosophy: Deus sive natura, God or nature.
Spinoza's definition of God is definitive: a substance consisting of infinite attributes. He argues God must exist because any cause that could prevent the existence of an absolutely infinite being would have to be either external to it,
Which is impossible, since substance is self-caused.
right, Or it would have to be internal, which would contradict the very definition of an infinite being. So existence follows necessarily from the definition. This single, infinite, necessary substance is God or nature. They are synonymous.
Let's spend some time on this, because this is the concept that earned him the title of atheist and heretic. This God is radically impersonal. What attributes of the traditional Abrahamic God does Spinoza's God not possess?
Well, pretty much all of them. Spinoza's God lacks all anthropomorphic traits. This God is not an individual entity, not a conscious creator.
So no personality.
No personality, no consciousness, no intelligence, no feeling, no free will. And crucially, Spinoza argues God does not act according to purpose. There is no divine plan.
No teleology.
None. Everything just happens from necessary natural law, not from divine intention.
So the idea that God created the world for a reason, or that God loves you and answers your prayers, all of that is wiped away.
From Spinoza's perspective, yes. He viewed the idea of God acting for a purpose like creating humanity as a mere human illusion born from our ignorance. If God had a purpose, it would imply God lacked something and needed to achieve it.
Which contradicts the definition of an infinite perfect substance.
Exactly. God is existence. God is the underlying law and structure of the universe, not a character in it.
When his critics accused him of crude materialism, of just equating God with rocks and trees, he strongly objected. How did he clarify this identity of God and nature?
He was very emphatic in denying that he equated God with mere corporeal matter. The material world, the physical cosmos, that's just a modification expressed under the attribute of extension. It is not the whole of God.
So how did he explain it?
Well, the German philosopher Karl Jaspers made a distinction that is essential to understanding Spinoza here. He distinguished between natura naturans and naturata.
Okay, let's hear that distinction, because it sounds key to reconciling God and nature.
Naturalations is nature naturing. This is the active, eternal, and necessary essence of everything. It's the underlying power and source of all things. This is God, the infinite substance.
And mantralata naturata.
That is nature already created. This is the finite, structured, physical world of modes that results from the necessary laws of naturans. So God is the cause. The world is the effect. They are identical in essence, but not interchangeable in function.
So some scholars argue this means he's not really a pantheist, where God is everything, but maybe a panentheist. That the world is in God, but God is greater than the world. Does that distinction matter for our understanding here?
It matters greatly for theological debate, sure. But for the listener, I think the takeaway is that Spinoza created a unified monistic system where nothing exists outside of God. Whether you call it panentheism or classical pantheism, the essential point remains. There is only one substance, and everything, including our mind, follows from the necessity of that substance.
And this leads us to the most intellectually challenging consequence of his system: strict determinism. If God nature is one necessary substance, then everything that happens must follow necessarily from its laws. Does that leave any room at all for human free will?
It leaves none whatsoever. Spinoza states it plainly. Things could not have been produced by God in any other way or in any other order than is the case. The universe is strictly necessary, fixed by immutable causality.
No contingencies, no accidents.
No free choices in the libertarian sense. Nothing could have been different.
But wait a minute. If everything is determined, if my decision to drink coffee this morning was determined by the entire causal chain of the universe stretching back to infinity, why bother striving for anything? I mean, doesn't this lead straight to fatalism or nihilism?
That is the most common objection, and Spinoza's response is, I think, really elegant. He says determinism doesn't remove action, it only removes the illusion of uncaused action.
What does he mean?
We strive, what he calls kenotis, because it is our nature, our very essence, to strive to persevere in our being. That striving itself is determined. Spinoza argues that we feel compelled to act, but we confuse that feeling of compulsion with the feeling of choice.
And he gave us that famous quote about the infant to illustrate how widespread this illusion is.
It's highly memorable because it just strips away our most cherished illusion. He said, "The infant believes that it is by free will that it seeks the breast. The angry boy believes that by free will he wishes vengeance."
All believe that they speak by a free command of the mind, whilst in truth they have no power to restrain the impulse.
And his stark conclusion from that is that men are conscious of their desire and unaware of the causes by which their desires are determined. Free will, for Spinoza, is simply the name we give to our profound ignorance of the true causes acting upon us.
So let's return to the mind and body. Spinoza rejected Cartesian dualism. that the mind is a separate, non-physical thing that somehow interacts with the physical body. How does his monism account for the connection between my thought and my physical action?
Spinoza's monism is radical. He argues that the mind and the body are one and the same thing, but they are just conceived under two different attributes, thought or extension.
Can you give an analogy for that? It's a tricky concept.
Sure. Think of it like this. If I decide to raise my hand, that decision, that idea, is a modification, a mode of substance under the attribute of thought. The physical act of my hand rising is the exact same modification, but it's perceived under the attribute of extension.
So it's like a song. The sheet music is the thought, and the sound waves are the extension. They're two completely different ways of representing the same underlying piece of music.
That is an excellent analogy.
But the sheet music doesn't cause the sound waves, and vice versa. They're just perfectly synchronized representations of the same thing.
That's it. Spinoza calls this the doctrine of psychophysical parallelism. The order and connection of ideas are the same as the order and connection of things. They are two faces of the same coin, which is the underlying substance. This completely eliminates the need to explain how an immaterial mind can push a material body around, which was the central, unsolvable problem of Cartesian dualism.
This philosophical unity extended directly into his analysis of psychology and emotion, which he viewed not as mysterious spirits, but as cognitive processes.
This is truly modern thinking. Spinoza views emotions, he calls them effects, as highly cognitive. He thinks they're often caused by flawed perceptions, which he calls inadequate ideas. Emotions for him are either passive or active.
That's a passive emotion.
A passive emotion is one where we suffer because we don't understand the true cause of what's happening to us. We are, in his terms, enslaved by forces external to our understanding.
And his great insight, one that really anticipates therapeutic practice centuries later, is how we move from that passive suffering to active understanding.
Exactly. The power of his insight lies in this transformation. When we grasp the true, necessary cause of a passive emotion, when we understand why we are suffering, that knowledge transforms the emotion into an active emotion. An active emotion is one that's derived from reason and understanding.
Can you give us a concrete example of that shift?
Certainly. Imagine you are insulted by a colleague at work. If you react with immediate, overwhelming anger, that anger is a passive emotion. You are suffering because of an external cause, the insult. You are enslaved by the event.
Okay.
Spinoza would argue that if you step back and through reason realize that the insult was not a reflection of your worth, but rather the necessary consequence of the colleague's own personal insecurity or their desperation or just a bad temper, you now see the cause.
You transform the feeling of being personal victimized into the intellectual understanding of necessity.
Yes. And that intellectual understanding fundamentally diminishes the emotional power of the event over you. The anger might transform into an active emotion, maybe irrational pity, or simply acceptance. You have gained power by replacing an inadequate passive idea, I was personally wronged, with an adequate rational idea. The colleague's action was a necessary determined outcome of their condition.
And that process of achieving adequate knowledge is the path to freedom.
It's the whole game.
Spinoza's system, while it is rigorously intellectual, is deeply concerned with how humans actually live and how they can achieve the best possible state of existence, both individually and, collectively.
Yes, his politics, though they're often seen as secondary to the ethics, are intrinsically linked to his ethical goal of achieving freedom within this necessary determined world. His final unfinished work was the Tractatus Politicus, or TP, written in 1676.
What was the goal of the TP?
It was intended to be a practical manual on good state function. Following his earlier secular arguments in the the TP set out to demonstrate that among all political arrangements, monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy, that democratic states are the best form of government.
Why do you think that?
Because he believed they most closely align with the natural striving of the individual, the conatus, to live freely and rationally.
But the sources also flag a significant contradiction here. Despite his radical secularism and his pro-democracy stance, his social views on gender were, they were conventional for the time.
They were disappointingly conventional. The TP included a very terse, unelaborated section concluding that women were naturally subordinate to men.
And why?
He just attributed this to inherent differences that he believed made them unfit for public office or political rule. While we, rightly judge this today, it is important to remember that his radicalism was focused purely on metaphysics and the separation of political and religious power, not on social hierarchy.
Okay, let's pivot to his core ethical concern, because this is the entire point of the ethics, right? How does one achieve salvation or blessedness in a determined universe with a completely impersonal God?
Spinoza defined the highest good, what he called blessedness, as the constant and eternal love of God. He refers to this ultimate state as the intellectual love of God, or amor Dei intellectualis.
This sounds completely paradoxical. If God lacks personality and doesn't love us back, how can we possibly love God?
That is the paradox that makes his ethics so profound. We don't love God in the sense of, reciprocal affection. Since God is identical to the necessary eternal laws of nature, the love is purely cognitive.
So what does it mean to love God then?
To love God means to fully, rationally understand and affirm the necessary order of the universe and our tiny place within it. It's the intellectual satisfaction you get from grasping the perfect, immutable structure of reality.
And this blessed state is linked directly to that concept you mentioned before, kenosis.
Yes, kenosis is the defining element of our existence. It means the striving, the effort, or the impulse of every single thing to persevere in its own being. For a human, our kenosis is driven by this desire for self-preservation and self-actualization.
And how does that relate to being perfect?
Spinoza argues that the more we act according to reason, and the less we are enslaved by our passive emotions, the more we fulfill our kenosis, and thus the more perfect we become.
But he also redefines perfection itself, moving away from moral judgment.
He clarifies that perfection does not mean moral excellence, it means completeness. Individual humans, being mere modifications or modes of the infinite substance, can never be absolutely complete or perfect. That absolute completeness is reserved solely for God, the substance itself.
So we strive toward a lesser form of completeness, a state of maximal fulfillment of our rational nature. How do we access this lesser blessedness?
Through knowledge. Spinoza posited 3 kinds of knowledge, which move us from slavery to freedom.
Okay, what's the first kind?
The first kind of knowledge is imagination, or opinion. This is sensory, it's fragmented, it's based on inadequate ideas, rumor, or poorly analyzed experience. This is the source of all passive emotion and suffering.
The default state for most of us, probably. What's the second?
The second kind of knowledge is reason. This is based on adequate, clear, and distinct common notions. It allows us to understand things deductively, establishing universal laws. This is where we grasp the general structure of the universe.
And finally, the highest state.
The third kind of knowledge, which he called intuitive knowledge. This is immediate, direct insight into the essence of things. It allows the individual to see themselves and all other modes not as isolated entities, but subspecie eternitatis.
Under the aspect of eternity.
Exactly, as necessary modifications of substance.
So this lesser blessedness is achieved through this intuitive knowledge, which allows us to see our own life and our own destiny as part of the total, necessary, and perfect order of God nature.
Precisely. When the mind links its fundamental striving, its kenosis, to this intuitive knowledge, that rational understanding naturally produces the highest possible human state, the intellectual love of God.
So freedom, in Spinoza's system, is not defying necessity.
No, it's rationally understanding and embracing it. We are most free when we act according to the laws of our own rational nature, which is itself a necessary part of nature.
It's a radical inversion of freedom. We're most free when we are most aligned with the necessary laws that govern us.
It's the ultimate rationalist project. He shifts the goal of life away from seeking supernatural salvation or praying for a miracle and towards objective study and reason. Through reason, we shed our passive suffering and become active participants in the eternal order.
Spinoza lived a cautious, isolated life, but after his death in 1677, his friends secretly published his Opera Postuma, which included the TTP and the Ethics, to prevent them from being confiscated and destroyed. The impact of these works was seismic, even if it was delayed by decades of suppression.
The impact was revolutionary. The great German philosopher Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel asserted that Spinoza is essentially a testing point in modern philosophy, so that it may really be said, you are either a Spinozist or not a philosopher at all.
That puts him in the absolute pantheon of Western thought. Why was his system so appealing to later generations of thinkers, especially those struggling with the implications of the Enlightenment?
Because Spinoza offered a compelling alternative to 2 extremes. On one hand, you had pure materialism that denied spirit, and on the other, you had traditional deism that separated God entirely from the world.
And Spinoza offered a middle path.
A unified path. He provided a model for the unity of existence, the regularity of everything that happens, and the fundamental identity of spirit, which he called thought, and nature, which he called extension.
And the list of thinkers influenced by him reads like a syllabus of 19th and 20th century intellectual history.
It's absolutely staggering. He influenced the German idealists like Kant, Fichte, and Schelling, and then later thinkers like Marx, Nietzsche, and even Freud. He was also particularly instrumental in post-war French philosophy.
How was Spinoza used in the French intellectual scene?
Well, French thinkers like Gilles Deleuze used Spinoza as a powerful bulwark against what they saw as the irrationalist and subjectivist tendencies of phenomenology and existentialism, which often prioritize the subjective human experience.
And Spinoza's system is the opposite of that.
It's a unified, objective, deterministic system. It offered a solid metaphysical foundation for understanding reality independent of human consciousness. Deleuze, who was profoundly influenced by him, named him the Prince of Philosophers.
Spinoza also captured the imagination of poets and novelists. I love the phrase Novalis used for him, the God-intoxicated man.
That phrase, God-intoxicated, it perfectly captures the intense, almost religious dedication Spinoza had to understanding the necessary, rational God of nature.
And he influenced writers too.
Oh, yes. Percy Shelley, whose essay, The Necessity of Atheism, echoed Spinoza's deterministic arguments. Jorge Luis Borges dedicated 2 sonnets to him. And there's Isaac Bashevis Singer's short story, The Spinoza of Market Street.
About a man who studies the ethics.
Yes, he studies it religiously, seeing in it a kind of divine order amidst the chaos of everyday life.
But perhaps the most enduring modern connection is between Spinoza and 20th century physics, bridging that 17th century rationalism with the modern scientific worldview.
Albert Einstein. He repeatedly cited Spinoza as the philosopher who had the most profound influence on his Weltanschauung, his worldview.
Why was that?
Einstein was deeply drawn to the idea of an impersonal deity that was equated with the elegant, orderly laws of nature.
This link became famous in 1929 when Einstein was asked a direct question about his beliefs via telegram. What was his reply, and how did it encapsulate Spinoza's system?
The telegram asked him, "Do you believe in God?" And his famous response was, "I believe in Spinoza's God, who reveals himself in the orderly harmony of what exists, not in a God who concerns himself with the fates and actions of human beings."
That is pure Spinozism.
It's the reverence for the mathematical, impersonal, immutable law of the universe. It is the intellectual love of God for the scientific age.
Finally, let's return to the beginning, the herem and his identity. His expulsion sparked this massive debate about whether he should be viewed as the first modern Jew.
His intellectual break with rabbinic tradition and his embrace of pure secular rationalism undoubtedly paved the way for the concept of the secular Jew, someone who maintains a cultural identity without religious observance. He profoundly shaped subsequent Jewish Enlightenment figures, the Haskalah, like Moses Mendelssohn.
And ironically, even while he was alienated from his community, one of his political writings was later seized upon by proto-Zionists.
Yes, that is due to a fascinating brief passage in the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus. Spinoza suggested that if the Jewish people could overcome what he called their religiously imposed discouragement of manliness, meaning physical and political strength.
What did he say would happen?
He said he would not hesitate to believe that they will one day, given the opportunity, establish once more their independent state.
Wow.
And this prophetic passage was used by secular Zionist forerunners like David Ben-Gurion, who saw Spinoza as the first secular proto-Zionist thinker.
Now, in the 21st century, there have been movements to officially lift the herem and welcome him back, metaphorically, into the fold. What has been the fate of those efforts?
The Portuguese Israelite commune of Amsterdam has consistently refused. The most recent instance was in 2015 when the chief rabbi maintained that Spinoza's ideas, his fundamental tearing apart of the concept of a divine, willful, personal God, had not become less problematic over time.
So the preposterous ideas are still preposterous?
To the Orthodox view, yes. The herem remains in effect, a 367-year-old marker of intellectual defiance.
So he remains an officially banished heretic. And yet his status in the Netherlands today is monumental. He's a cultural and intellectual hero.
He is a core figure in Dutch history. His portrait was on the 1,000 guilder banknote, and the highest scientific award in the country is named the Spinoza Prize. His enduring legacy lies in his success at intellectually separating theology from politics and establishing the rigorous path of modern rationalism.
A path that demanded we understand the world through necessary, objective law.
Right.
And the final word on his political vision remains inscribed on the statue dedicated to him in Amsterdam, a quote from the TTP.
It reads, "The objective of the state is freedom, a freedom defined not by political whims, but by rational self-governance."
Spinoza's trajectory, from merchant to exiled lens grinder to monumental philosopher, is one of pure, defiant intellectual striving. He challenged us to accept the most difficult truth, that we are not the center of the universe, and we are not endowed with some special magical free will.
His final teaching was that understand the true causes of our actions, replacing our inadequate ideas with adequate ones, is the only way to move toward genuine freedom and blessedness. It is the ultimate act of rational self-mastery.
So here's a provocative thought for you to carry forward as you conclude this deep dive. If, as Spinoza argues, everything that happens, including your specific thoughts, your most cherished desires, and your greatest decisions, follows necessarily from the immutable, eternal laws of nature, does true human freedom lie not in the ability to choose differently from what is, but rather in the purely rational acceptance, through intellectual love, of the necessity of the universe? And if so, what would it take for you to truly embrace that necessity?